The busy airport buzzed with travelers rushing to their gates. Flight 2187 to Chicago was set to depart in 40 minutes, and the boarding area was packed with people. Among them stood Tom Chen, a man in his mid-30s with tired eyes and a kind smile. He wasn't much to look at that day. His navy blue shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his hair needed a trim. But appearances can be deceiving. Tom patiently waited his turn in the boarding line, holding his one carry-on in one hand and a small black medical bag in the other. He'd been on his feet for nearly 24 hours, having finished an overnight shift at the community clinic where he worked as a physician assistant. The medical conference in Chicago couldn't have come at a worse time, but Tom knew the latest trauma care techniques he'd learned there would help his patients back home. As he shuffled forward in the economy boarding line, Tom couldn't help but noticed two men in expensive suits standing in the first-class line. They weren't even trying to keep their voices down. "Look at these people," said the taller one, a heavy-set man with a flashy watch. "Packed in like sardines just to save a few $100. His friend, thin and sharp-featured, laughed. "That's why I never fly economy. Not worth the hassle." His eyes landed on Tom's rumpled appearance and medical bag. "Especially when you have to sit next to someone who looks like they slept in their clothes." Tom pretended not to hear, but he felt his cheeks grow warm. He'd been too exhausted to iron his shirt after his shift. The truth was, he could have afforded a better ticket if he'd wanted. The conference was covering basic travel expenses, but he'd opted to fly economy and donate the difference to the clinic's medication fund for uninsured patients. The boarding process began, with first-class passengers going first, of course. The two men strode past Tom, still snickering. One of them bumped Tom's shoulder as he passed, not even bothering to apologize. When it was finally time for economy passengers to board, Tom handed his boarding pass to the flight attendant, a woman named Heather with perfectly applied makeup and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Seat 32B, she said, barely glancing at him. "That's all the way in the back." Just then, one of the first-class passengers who had boarded earlier reappeared at the jet bridge entrance. "Excuse me," he called out loudly. "I need assistance with my carry-on right away." Heather's smile became strained. "Sir, I'll be with you in just a moment." "I paid for first-class service," the man insisted. "I shouldn't have to wait." Flustered and clearly worried about keeping the first-class passenger waiting, Heather turned back to Tom. "You need to hurry up, sir. You're holding up the line." She practically shoved his boarding pass back at him, causing Tom to stumble slightly. His medical bag slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor, spilling a few items: a stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff, and a small notepad. "I'm sorry," Tom said quietly, kneeling to gather his belongings. "Just move along, please," Heather urged, already turning her attention to the demanding first-class passenger. As Tom scrambled to collect his things, he noticed a woman watching him from the business class line. She had curly hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wore a navy blazer. For a moment, their eyes met, and she looked like she might say something or offer help. But then she glanced at the irritated passengers behind her and simply looked away. Tom repacked his bag and made his way down the narrow airplane aisle. He could feel eyes on him as he passed the spacious first-class section. The two men who had mocked him earlier were already sipping complimentary drinks, their seats wide and comfortable. One nudged the other as Tom passed, and they shared another laugh at his expense. By the time Tom reached his cramped middle seat in row 32, his face was burning with embarrassment. A teenage boy occupied the window seat, already lost in whatever game he was playing on his phone. The aisle seat remained empty for now. Tom stowed his bags and settled in, taking a deep breath. He wasn't one to dwell on rude encounters. His work at the clinic had taught him that everyone was fighting their own battles. Still, it stung to be judged so quickly, to be seen as less than because of a wrinkled shirt and an economy seat. Little did anyone know that in just a few hours, every person on this plane would see Tom very differently indeed. 3 hours into the flight, Tom had managed to doze off despite the limited legroom in his economy seat. The teenage boy next to him was still glued to his video game, and an elderly woman had taken the aisle seat, quietly knitting what looked like a baby blanket. The cabin lights had been dimmed, and most passengers were either sleeping or watching movies on the small screens in front of them. Tom woke with a start when the plane suddenly shuddered. His years working in emergency medicine had trained him to go from sleep to full alertness in seconds. He glanced out the window, but all he could see was a thick wall of dark clouds. Another jolt rocked the aircraft, stronger this time. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Tom noticed the change in the captain's tone, professionally calm on the surface, but with an undercurrent of tension that most passengers would miss. As a man who had worked through countless emergencies, Tom recognized the sound of someone trying to keep worry out of their voice. He watched as the flight attendants hurriedly made their way down the aisles, checking seatbelts and securing loose items. Heather, the attendant who had rushed him during boarding, moved with quick, practiced motions, but her eyes told a different story. She exchanged a meaningful glance with another crew member, the kind of silent communication that spoke volumes. The plane dropped suddenly, as if the floor had fallen away beneath them. Tom's stomach lurched, and several passengers gasped. A few carry-on items tumbled from overhead bins, and someone's water bottle rolled down the aisle. "Is this normal?" whispered the elderly woman beside Tom, her knitting now clutched tightly in trembling hands. "Just a bit of rough air," Tom assured her with a gentle smile. "Planes are built to handle much worse." The aircraft shook violently again, and this time the drop was severe enough that a few passengers screamed. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a collective thunk that sent a ripple of panic through the cabin. "This is Captain Wilson," came the voice over the intercom again, noticeably more strained now. "We're attempting to navigate around a severe storm system. As a precaution, oxygen masks have been deployed. Please place them over your nose and mouth and breathe normally." Tom helped the elderly woman with her mask before securing his own. His hands moved steadily while others fumbled with shaking fingers. The teenage boy beside him had gone pale, his game forgotten. "I've flown hundreds of times," Tom told them both quietly. "This looks scarier than it is." He wasn't sure if that was entirely true, but his calm demeanor seemed to steady them. In emergency medicine, Tom had learned that sometimes confidence was as important as knowledge. Through the gap between seats, Tom could see into the first-class section where the two men who had mocked him were sitting. The taller one was gripping his armrests so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His friend had his eyes squeezed shut, lips moving in what might have been a prayer. The woman from the boarding area, the one in the navy blazer who had briefly caught his eye, was seated in the business class section just ahead of economy. Unlike most passengers, she wasn't panicking. Instead, she was helping a young mother calm her crying toddler in the seat beside her. The plane continued to buck and drop through the turbulence. Tom noticed the flight attendants huddled near the front galley, having an intense discussion. One of them kept glancing back at the cockpit door with worry etched on her face. Another violent lurch sent an unattended drink cart rolling backward down the aisle. Without thinking, Tom reached out and caught it before it could hit anyone, earning grateful looks from nearby passengers. The simple act of stopping the cart shifted something in the atmosphere around him. People began watching him, taking cues from his composure. The cabin lights flickered ominously, plunging the aircraft into momentary darkness before returning to their dim glow. The storm outside seemed to be growing worse, rain lashing against the windows. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the cabin with an eerie blue light. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came again, but this time there was something different about it, a slight slurring that made Tom sit up straighter. "We are attempting to find a clearing." The message cut off abruptly. Tom's medical instincts kicked into high alert. Something was wrong, very wrong, and it wasn't just the storm. Little did he know that in mere minutes, every person on this plane would be looking to him for help. The strange cut-off in the captain's announcement left an uneasy silence hanging in the air. Tom watched as Heather and another flight attendant hurried toward the cockpit, their faces tight with worry. When the cockpit door opened briefly, Tom caught a glimpse of the co-pilot's panicked expression before the door closed again. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The plane continued to shake violently as it pushed through the storm. Tom noticed the elderly woman beside him clutching a small photo of what looked like her grandchildren. He gently patted her hand. "It's going to be okay," he said quietly. "Try to take deep breaths." Suddenly, Heather emerged from the cockpit. Her professional mask had slipped, revealing raw fear underneath. She grabbed the plane's intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice trembled slightly. "Is there a doctor or anyone with medical training on board? If so, please press your call button immediately." A chill ran down Tom's spine. Without hesitation, he pressed the button above his seat. The elderly woman looked at him with surprise. "You're a doctor?" she asked. "Physician assistant," Tom explained. "I worked as a military medic before that." 2 other call buttons lit up in the cabin, one in business class and one near the front of economy. Heather quickly made her way down the aisle, stopping first at a passenger about 10 rows ahead of Tom. After a brief conversation, she moved on, looking increasingly desperate. When she reached Tom's row, he spoke before she could ask. "I'm a PA with emergency medicine experience. What's happening?" Relief washed over Heather's face. "The captain, he's collapsed. He's unconscious and the co-pilot can't wake him up." Tom unbuckled his seatbelt immediately. "I'll help. Let me grab my medical bag." As he stood to retrieve his bag from the overhead bin, the plane lurched again. Tom steadied himself against the seats. Passengers watched him with a mixture of curiosity and hope. The woman in the business class section, the one with the curly hair and navy blazer, had also stood up. "I'm a nurse," she called out. "Do you need assistance?" "Yes, please," Tom nodded gratefully. As they made their way toward the cockpit, they passed through first class. The 2 men who had mocked Tom earlier stared with wide eyes. The thinner one grabbed Tom's arm as he passed. "What's going on?" he demanded, his earlier arrogance replaced with fear. "Are we going to crash?" "Sir, I need you to stay calm and in your seat," Tom replied firmly. "Let me do my job." The other first-class passenger scoffed, though his face was pale with terror. "Your job? What can someone like you possibly do?" Tom didn't waste time responding. Lives were at stake, and petty insults weren't worth his attention. He and the nurse followed Heather to the cockpit, where another flight attendant stood guard at the door. "The co-pilot says we're 20 minutes from the nearest airport," Heather explained as they hurried. "But he's struggling to handle everything alone." When the cockpit door opened, Tom was hit by the seriousness of the situation. The captain lay slumped in his seat, his face ashen. The co-pilot, a young man who looked barely 30, was sweating profusely as he fought to keep the plane stable with one hand while trying to radio for emergency landing clearance with the other. "Thank God," the co-pilot breathed when he saw Tom. "I think he's having a heart attack. I don't know what to do. I need to fly this plane." Tom knelt beside the unconscious captain, his training kicking in. He checked for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. The captain's breathing was shallow, and his skin felt clammy. "What's your name?" Tom asked the nurse who had followed him. "Diane," she replied, already rolling up her sleeves. "Okay, Diane. I need you to help me move him to the floor where we have more room to work." Together, they carefully moved the captain as the plane continued to buck and shake through the storm. Tom opened his medical bag and pulled out his stethoscope. "Is he going to be okay?" the co-pilot asked, his voice strained as he struggled with the controls. "I'm going to do everything I can," Tom promised, not sugarcoating the severity of the situation. "But right now, your job is to focus on flying this plane. Can you do that?" The co-pilot nodded, though fear lingered in his eyes. As Tom began assessing the captain, he could hear whispers spreading through the cabin behind him. Word was traveling fast that something was seriously wrong. He knew panic could spread just as quickly if he didn't act with confidence and control. What had started as a routine flight had now become a race against time, not just for the captain's life, but for everyone on board. The cockpit felt impossibly small with 4 people crammed inside. Tom worked methodically on the captain, who remained unconscious on the floor. Diane knelt beside him, following his instructions with the practiced ease of an experienced nurse. "Blood pressure's dropping," Tom said as he checked the reading. "Pulse is irregular. Classic signs of a heart attack." The plane jolted violently, nearly throwing them against the control panel. Outside the windows, lightning flashed through thick, angry clouds. "How bad is the storm?" Tom asked the co-pilot, who was wrestling with the controls. "Bad," the young man replied, his voice tight. "And getting worse. I'm Pete, by the way." "Tom, Wish we were meeting under better circumstances. He turned back to the captain. We need to stabilize him. Diane, do you see the small black case in my bag? There should be aspirin inside. As Diane searched for the medication, Tom addressed Heather, who hovered anxiously by the door. Does the plane have medical equipment? An AED or emergency kit? Yes, under the front galley, she answered quickly. I'll get it. While Heather hurried to retrieve the equipment, Tom continued his assessment. The captain's breathing was becoming more labored. This wasn't just about saving one man's life anymore. Without the captain, they were all at increased risk. Pete, what's our situation? Tom asked, keeping his voice steady despite the gravity of the circumstances. Pete wiped sweat from his brow with his sleeve. I've requested emergency landing clearance at Cleveland. They've approved, but his voice trailed off. But what? The weather's horrible, visibility near zero, and I've never made an emergency landing in conditions like this before. The fear in Pete's eyes was unmistakable. Usually, the captain handles the really tough landings. Tom absorbed this information while administering aspirin to the unconscious captain. Heather returned with the emergency medical kit, which Tom quickly opened to find basic life-saving supplies. I need to monitor him continuously, Tom explained to Diane. But I think Pete needs help too. He glanced at the complex instrument panel. During his military service, Tom had received some basic flight training, nothing that qualified him to fly a commercial airliner, but enough to understand the fundamentals. Pete, how can I help you while still caring for the captain? The co-pilot looked relieved just to have someone ask. Could you handle the radio communications, and maybe help me watch these weather displays? I'm struggling to do everything at once. Tom nodded. I can do that. He turned to Diane. Can you keep monitoring his vitals? Call out any changes immediately. Of course, she replied, taking the stethoscope from him. Tom moved to the co-pilot's side, careful not to touch any controls. The instrument panel was intimidating, dozens of switches, buttons, and screens displaying information about altitude, speed, heading, and more. Talk me through what you need, Tom said. I've had some basic flight training, but nothing like this. Pete pointed to a screen showing weather radar. Red areas are the worst storm cells. We need to navigate between them if possible. Tom studied the display. Looks like there's a narrow path between those two cells to the east. You're right, Pete said, sounding surprised. Can you radio air traffic control and tell them we're adjusting course to heading 085? Tom picked up the radio handset, remembering protocols from his limited training. Cleveland Control, this is Flight 2187, adjusting course to heading 085 to avoid storm cells, over. A crackly voice responded, confirming the course change. Tom felt a small sense of accomplishment. He was actually helping. Behind them, Diane called out, blood pressure stabilizing, but still low. Pulse is still irregular. Keep monitoring him, Tom replied. Let me know if anything changes. For the next several minutes, Tom juggled both roles, helping Pete navigate through the storm while regularly checking on the captain's condition. The plane continued to shake violently, but Pete seemed more confident with Tom's assistance. How far to Cleveland? Tom asked, studying the navigation display. About 50 miles, Pete replied. 10 minutes if we can maintain speed. Suddenly, warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. An alarm blared through the cockpit. What's that? Tom asked, fighting to keep his voice calm. Pete's face went pale. Wind shear alert. This is bad, really bad. Tom felt his heart race, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. Tell me what to do. We need to increase power and maintain altitude, Pete explained, his hands moving quickly over the controls. But with these crosswinds, he trailed off, his expression grim. Tom looked back at the captain, still unconscious but stable for now, then at the terrifying storm outside the windows. In the main cabin, hundreds of passengers were counting on them, never knowing that their lives now depended on a co-pilot who'd never handled an emergency landing and a physician assistant who'd been mocked and dismissed just hours earlier. We can do this, Pete, Tom said with more confidence than he felt. Let's get these people safely on the ground. The wind shear alarm continued to blare as the plane shuddered violently. Tom gripped the back of Pete's seat to keep his balance. Outside the cockpit windows, there was nothing but dark, angry clouds illuminated occasionally by flashes of lightning. What exactly is wind shear? Tom asked, trying to understand what they were facing. Pete's hands were white-knuckled on the controls. It's sudden changes in wind direction or speed, like hitting invisible walls of air. It can push a plane down too fast or even flip it. Tom felt his mouth go dry. How do we handle it? We need maximum power to push through, Pete explained, his voice strained. But I have to be careful not to overcompensate or we could stall. The plane dropped suddenly, and Tom nearly lost his footing. Behind them, Diane let out a small cry, but kept her position next to the captain. How's he doing? Tom called over his shoulder. Stable for now, Diane answered. But we need to get him to a hospital soon. Through the cockpit door, Tom could hear passengers crying out in fear with each violent jolt of the aircraft. He thought of the elderly woman next to his seat, the teenage boy, the mother with her child. All terrified, all counting on them. Pete, I can see you're exhausted, Tom said, noticing the co-pilot's fatigue. I'll help however I can. Pete nodded gratefully. Can you handle radio communications completely? I need to focus entirely on flying. Absolutely. Tom picked up the headset and put it on. Cleveland approach, this is Flight 2187, he said, trying to sound confident despite never having done this before. We're experiencing severe wind shear at 15,000 feet. Request priority landing guidance. The controller's voice came back immediately. Flight 2187, understood. We're tracking your situation. Continue descent to 10,000 feet when able. Emergency services standing by. As Tom relayed the instructions to Pete, he noticed something on the weather radar display. Pete, look, there's a small gap in the storm cells about 20 degrees to our right. Pete squinted at the screen. You're right. Good catch. He adjusted their course slightly. A memory suddenly flashed in Tom's mind, a training exercise from his military days. One of the helicopter pilots had shown him how to handle unexpected wind patterns. Pete, my friend who flew helicopters, used to say that in rough winds, it's sometimes better to relax your grip slightly, not fight the small movements but flow with them while maintaining your general direction. Pete gave him a quick, surprised glance. That's actually good advice. Commercial pilots usually maintain firm control, but in these conditions, he adjusted his grip, seeming to work with the plane's motion rather than against it. Gradually, the violent shaking subsided slightly. It's working, Pete said with relief. We're not fighting the wind as much. Though still in dangerous conditions, they were making progress. Tom continued handling communications with air traffic control while helping Pete monitor the instruments. Every few minutes, he checked on the captain, whose condition remained unchanged, not better, but at least not worse. As they descended through the storm clouds, the cockpit briefly went dark as the electrical system fluctuated. The backup systems kicked in immediately, but the moment of darkness sent a fresh wave of fear through everyone. Pete, you're doing great, Tom reassured him. Stay focused. Through breaks in the clouds, Tom caught glimpses of lights below. Cleveland was coming into view. They were getting closer to safety. Flight 2187, Cleveland approach, the radio crackled. Runway 24 Lighters is cleared for your emergency landing. Wind at 30 knots, gusting to 45 from the northwest. Tom relayed the information to Pete, whose face tightened with concern. That's a strong crosswind, Pete muttered. Really strong. Can we handle it? Tom asked. I've never landed in crosswinds this severe, Pete admitted. The captain would normally take over in conditions like these. Tom noticed Pete's hands trembling slightly on the controls. The young co-pilot was reaching his breaking point after nearly 30 minutes of intense flying through the worst conditions of his career. Pete, I need you to listen to me, Tom said firmly. You can do this. You've been trained for this. I'll be right here with you. Their eyes met briefly, and Tom saw Pete's resolve strengthen. The co-pilot nodded. Okay, let's get these people home safely. In the main cabin, passengers gripped their armrests as the plane continued to buck and sway. The two first-class passengers who had mocked Tom earlier were now white-faced with fear, staring fixedly at the cockpit door as if willing it to open and reveal some miracle. Little did they know that behind that door, the man they had dismissed was now working alongside the co-pilot, becoming the unexpected hero everyone on board desperately needed. Cleveland's city lights glimmered through patches of rain as Flight 2187 descended through the storm clouds. Inside the cockpit, tension was at its peak. Pete's face was a mask of concentration as he prepared for what would be the most challenging landing of his career. "Airport in sight," Pete announced, his voice tight. "Runway visual at 2 o'clock. Tom peered through the windshield and spotted the parallel lines of bright lights marking runway 24 lighters. Rain lashed against the glass, distorting the view. "Flight 2187, be advised," the air traffic controller's voice crackled over the radio. "Wind now gusting to 50 knots across the runway. Use extreme caution." Tom relayed the warning to Pete, whose expression grew even more concerned. "That's right at the aircraft's crosswind limit," Pete muttered. "The manual says we shouldn't attempt landing in these conditions." "What are our options?" Tom asked. "We could divert to Cincinnati, but—" Pete glanced back at the unconscious captain. "That's another 30 minutes of flight time. He might not have that long." Tom checked the captain's pulse again, still weak and irregular. "You're right. We need to land here if possible." The decision made, Pete began their final approach. The plane bucked and swayed in the powerful crosswinds. Warning alarms occasionally sounded as they encountered wind shear, but Pete handled each episode with increasing confidence. 8,000 feet, Pete called out, "Gear down." A mechanical rumble vibrated through the aircraft as the landing gear deployed. "Cleveland Tower, Flight 2187 on final approach," Tom said into the radio. "Be advised we have a medical emergency on board. Request ambulance at the gate." "Copy that, Flight 2187. Emergency services standing by. You are cleared to land." In the passenger cabin, Heather was moving through the aisles, checking that everyone was properly secured for the rough landing ahead. The plane jumped violently in the crosswinds, causing several passengers to cry out in fear. Back in the cockpit, Tom noticed Pete struggling with the controls as they descended through 5,000 feet. The younger man's arms were visibly shaking from the physical effort of keeping the aircraft stable. "Pete, my friend who flew in desert conditions, used to talk about this technique," Tom said, remembering another conversation from his military days. "He called it crabbing, approaching at an angle to the runway, then straightening just before touchdown." Pete's eyes lit up with recognition. "That's exactly right. It's the standard technique for crosswind landings. But the timing has to be perfect." "You can do this," Tom assured him. "I've seen how skilled you are." The runway was growing larger in the windshield as they descended through 3,000 feet, then 2,000. The storm seemed to throw everything it had at them: rain, wind, and dangerous gusts that threatened to push them off course. Diane continued monitoring the captain, who remained unconscious but stable. "Whatever you two are doing up there," she called to them, "keep doing it. We're all counting on you." At 1,000 feet, the turbulence intensified. A particularly violent gust caught the plane's wing, tilting them dangerously to one side. Pete fought the controls, sweat pouring down his face. "I don't know if I can hold it," he shouted over the noise of the wind and engines. Without thinking, Tom placed his hands lightly on the co-pilot's control wheel, not taking over but adding his strength to Pete's. "Together," he said firmly. "We'll do this together." The runway loomed ahead, wet tarmac glistening under the bright landing lights. At 500 feet, another gust rocked them violently. Coming in at too steep an angle, Pete warned, "We need to level out." Tom recalled something else from his training days. "Try adding a touch more power," he suggested. "It might give us better control without increasing speed too much." Pete adjusted the throttle slightly, and the plane's descent rate improved. They were now just 200 feet above the runway, still fighting the crosswinds but more stable than before. 50 feet, Pete called out, fully focused on the landing. 40, 30. Tom held his breath as the ground rushed up to meet them. The plane was still crabbed at an angle to counteract the crosswind. 20 feet, 10. At the last possible moment, Pete straightened the aircraft, aligning it with the runway centerline just as the wheels touched down. The impact was harder than a normal landing, and a screeching sound filled the air as the tires made contact with the wet runway. "Reverse thrust," Pete called out, pulling levers to slow their speed. The The plane bounced once, twice, then settled onto the runway, still moving too fast on the rain-slicked surface. They could feel the aircraft wanting to slide sideways in the powerful crosswinds. "Stay with it," Tom encouraged, his eyes fixed on the rapidly passing runway lights. "You've got this." Gradually, their speed decreased. The violent shaking subsided as Pete brought the aircraft under control. After what seemed like an eternity, the plane slowed enough for Pete to turn off the runway onto a taxiway. "Flight 2187, welcome to Cleveland," the tower controller said, obvious relief in his voice. "Emergency vehicles are waiting at Gate 12. A cheer erupted from the passenger cabin as people realized they had landed safely. Some were crying with relief, others hugging total strangers seated next to them. Pete leaned back in his seat, physically and emotionally drained. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." Tom squeezed his shoulder. "You did it, Pete. I just offered a few suggestions." As they taxied toward the gate, Tom knew the emergency was far from over. The captain still needed immediate medical attention. But against incredible odds, they had safely brought Flight 2187 back to Earth.